Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
Was how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, the Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. As one of his first actions in office, U.S. President Donald Trump ordered a 90-day freeze on foreign assistance pending review for alignment with U.S. foreign policy goals. Subsequent moves by the administration, including the aggressive downsizing and de facto elimination of the U.S. Agency for International Development, have roiled Washington and resulted in far-reaching implications. Within the Western Hemisphere, the Andean region, and particularly Colombia, stands to be one of the countries most impacted by these funding freezes. In 2024, 70% of Colombia's foreign humanitarian assistance funding came from the United States. Much of U.S. aid to the country goes to support disarmament and demobilization programs for former insurgents, as well as alternative livelihood efforts to reduce coca cultivation. To help us unpack the consequences of cutting this aid, as well as how the broader region beyond Colombia, including Ecuador and Peru, might be affected by the aid cuts, we're honored to be joined by Elizabeth Dickinson, Senior Analyst for the Andes at Crisis Group. In this episode, we dig into the effects of aid freezes on public security, how the situation in the Andean region is evolving, and what actors might be filling the gaps as time goes on. Thank you for joining us today, Beth.
Really a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Beth, can you begin by sketching a scene setter for our audience? What have been the immediate effects of the uncertainty around foreign assistance funding in Colombia and other Latin American countries? How have governments reacted?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this was really a shock, particularly in Colombia, which listeners might know is perhaps the most pro-American country in the entire Western Hemisphere. Depends deeply on assistance from the United States, but was also just very aligned with a number of U.S. interests. Has worked over decades to build a stronger security presence in cooperation with the United States to tackle shared threats. So this was really, I think, first and foremost, a shock to Colombia and to Colombians. And it came at a moment, I think we can't forget the context. This announcement came at a moment when Colombia is experiencing its most significant security crisis since the 2016 peace accord that demobilized the former FARC leftist rebellion. In the context of Colombia facing a very difficult security situation, struggling to implement a 2016 peace agreement that could stabilize the country, to have this assistance sort of pulled out, I think has really been a shock, and I think, frankly, a real slap in the face. Has raised a lot of questions about the consistency and reliability of the United States as an ally. Across the broader region, I think a similar reaction has taken place. Peru and Ecuador obviously received less assistance relatively than Colombia. But in Ecuador, for example, there's been a real effort, not just under the current administration, but under previous administrations as well, to try to court more U.S. assistance, particularly to help combat some of the threats from organized crime, rising levels of gang violence. And so to sort of see this freeze at this particular critical moment for the region was really devastating.
Beth, you mentioned that the single government most affected by the changes to foreign assistance in the Western Hemisphere is Colombia, a fact made all the more challenging thanks to strained relations between Trump and Petro. Since Petro's election, U.S. and Colombian officials alike have affirmed time and again that even when they have high-level tensions, day-to-day cooperation between the two countries continues. From your perspective, has that baseline level of partnership changed in recent weeks?
So first, I think I want to really emphasize that I agree with the assessment that up until, the change in administration, despite very significant differences on certain policies, particularly with regards to drugs and supply control, for specifically coca eradication, coca being the raw material for cocaine. Despite differences on that issue, the Petro administration and the Biden administration, I think, realized that this is a fundamental relationship, a security partnership that is really the foothold of U.S. capabilities in the region. I think that's very correct to say that the cooperation continued at a very high level. The two governments found interests where they aligned, particularly on the environment, the implementation of the peace accord, human rights, and security cooperation. That all continued despite some sort of public political differences. I think one of the reasons that this current freeze has been such a shock is because it's the first time, really in decades, that the bipartisan consensus of support for Colombia has disappeared, it seems, and allowed this sort of bureaucratic level day-to-day cooperation to stop. And I really can't overemphasize the blow that this is to the security forces, to the government itself, which cooperated on a very high level, for example, with USAID on the implementation of the peace agreement. And so the change this time is actually not the high-level political disagreements. Those continue, and of course will come up in the media. What's changed is actually that big ship that we all thought would be very hard to steer in a different direction because there's so much history and connection and interconnectivity between the two countries. That's what stopped. And I think that's one of the reasons that this is so devastating.
So, among many other things, these diplomatic tensions have raised the specter that Colombia could lose its certification as a U.S. partner in the fight against illicit narcotics. In your opinion, how likely is the process we call decertification, and what would the implications be for US-Colombia relations?
I think it's important to take one step back and talk about what Colombia does in terms of cooperation with the United States on counter-narcotics. And here's an area where I really want to point out a dissonance in the rhetoric. The Trump administration has come out very strong against drug trafficking in an effort to sort of crack down on these organizations. At the same time, the administration has frozen key security support to the Colombian police that they have relied on for decades to undertake counter-narcotics operations. At the same time that, they're talking big about cracking down on cartels, they've completely undermined their own ability to do that and for Colombia to do that. I'll give you one clear example. Police intelligence relies very heavily on cooperation with the United States. That's to find suspects, to mount cases, to go after these networks. That has been completely frozen since the funding was stopped. I think that this is a real contrast because if we're talking about decertifying Colombia for not cooperating on counter-narcotics, the ones who stopped cooperating were the United States. Colombia has been ready to work on joint operations and continues to hope that that aid returns. Now, if Colombia were to be decertified, that could mean a more permanent freeze to some of this cooperation, which again would have completely the opposite effect of what at least the rhetoric from the Trump administration is intending. Without U.S. support, police in Colombia will have less capabilities to go after drug trafficking organizations. They will have less capabilities to mount investigations, to stop the flow of drugs, to seize drugs that are heading to the United States. So it would be a deeply counterproductive move on the part of the U.S. government, I think, to consider decertification.
Can you go into some of the details, Beth, of decertification? What would be not permitted if we did, in fact, decertify Colombia as a partner in the fight against illicit narcotics?
So what the decertification process really means is it's sort of a way to designate Colombia as an unhelpful country who's not interested in working on U.S. priorities. I can't think of any country for which that is less true. Colombia is the country who is always raising their hand to help with U.S. security interests. The implications, again, would be to limit that security cooperation, potentially intelligence sharing. I think it would put a freeze, really, not a total freeze, but it would send a chill, certainly, through the relationship. And I think, again, have completely opposite effect of what would be intended from the decertification.
In your opinion, how has the aid freeze impacted Colombia's capacity to respond to the recent outbreak of violence in the Catatumbo region, which you mentioned in your opening remarks, which is, for our listeners who don't know, on Colombia's border with Venezuela?
Yeah, so I'll give you some very specific examples. Just days before the change in administration, the ELN, the National Liberation Army, which is the largest remaining leftist insurgency in Colombia, unleashed a calibrated and orchestrated attack across the region along the border with Venezuela that targeted largely civilians. We're talking about more than 80,000 people displaced from their homes, 63 people killed so far, and the worst, really the worst security crisis that Colombia has experienced since the peace accord. Immediately with the USAID freeze, we saw the impact. And I'll give you a few concrete examples. USAID had programs, for example, to help protect and evacuate social leaders, community figures who are important, who are threatened in conflict situations. That funding was stopped. USAID supported programs to help former cocoa farmers transition to the listed economy. That was stopped. USAID had a fundamental land titling program in Catatumbo. One of the main sources of conflict here in Colombia for decades has been the lack of land titles. No one knows who owns which pieces of land, which makes everyone vulnerable to displacement and being pushed off their land, largely by armed actors. USAID was one of the only ones on the ground who were trying to fix that problem, who were going, plot to plot with small farmers and trying to map out who had the right to the land, who could own it, who could then get access to credit. all the basis of a rural economy that could be stable, all of that funding was stopped. That is on the development side. On the security side, the implications are in many ways even more immediate and grave. With the freeze in the security funding, again, one of the key impacts is intelligence. So in a place like Catatumbo, it's very difficult to know who is who. The ELN is not necessarily wearing uniforms. The FARC dissidents are not necessarily wearing uniforms. Intelligence is fundamental. And when those capabilities don't work, you cannot execute operations. In addition, reaching these regions in Colombia is very challenging. This is terrain we're talking about few roads, jungles, very dense areas, where it might take 3-4 days by road to reach a certain area, or by river in some cases, and helicopter transport is fundamental. When the funding freeze happened from the United States, roughly 75% of all police helicopters in Colombia are dependent on US funding. So we had suddenly no air power, no intelligence, and a significantly reduced capacity to deal with some of the structural effects and the immediate humanitarian fallout of this crisis.
Thank you very much, Beth. That's a very important answer as well, particularly as it pertains to impacting the Colombian military's readiness to take on this fight. But Colombia is not the only country whose security is heavily impacted by funding holds and reductions in funding. Fellow Andean countries such as Ecuador and Peru are also struggling to contain surging flows of illicit drugs and violent criminal groups that they fuel. Ecuador in particular has seen an explosion of violence in the last several years. So I want to drill down on those two countries now. What role did U.S. assistance play in Ecuador and in Peru and in some of the security efforts there? And how much of an impact do you see the freeze having at the moment?
So a lot of the funding that we're talking about in security assistance comes from a part of the State Department called INL, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. In recent years, with the crisis in Ecuador, some of the funding that previously went to Colombia actually moved towards Ecuador to deal with this very extreme crisis of organized crime and the expansion of transnational networks into the country. So this would involve things like building intelligence capacities, vetted units. Let's talk about vetted units and how important they are to U.S. security interests. A U.S. vetted unit is a local police unit that is interviewed, cleared in terms of security by the United States and has a direct role in operations that the U.S. believes are in its interests. Shared interest with Ecuador or Colombia, but these are units that really serve goals that are shared by the United States. Those are supported by INL. And when the INL funding freezes, the vetted units can no longer work on those cases that are important to both countries. In addition, I think Ecuador particularly has been really seeking a stronger partnership with the United States. And so it's very unfortunate that this freeze happened at this time. Listeners will remember that the U.S. was essentially kicked out of Ecuador for many years in terms of security assistance because of political disagreements. And although they had tried to come back in, this was sort of a golden opportunity for the United States to have eyes and ears on the ground in one of the epicenters of transnational crime. Losing that opportunity would be an enormous mistake, I think, in terms of U.S. interest, but also in terms of broader regional security. Peru, for its part, obviously a smaller recipient of security funding, but here I want to emphasize an emerging trend that we see in transnational criminal networks that are increasingly moving into the Amazon region. And in the coming years, Peru will play an increasingly important role in those networks, moving not only drugs, but also arms, products coming from mines. We're talking about rare earth minerals, gold, and even migrants. So having a boots on the ground and sort of a footprint there in Peru was important to start working on that relationship.
The United States designated 8 drug trafficking groups as foreign terrorist organizations recently. Notably missing from this list was the Gulf Clan, which is a major player in South American criminal dynamics, based in Colombia, but obviously with operations in quite a few other places. In your opinion, should there be an FTO designation for the Gulf Clan, and what does this signal about U.S. priorities for countering organized crime in the region?
Let's talk first about the pros and cons of an FTO designation for an organized criminal group. First, I think the increased capabilities that an FTO would offer to policymakers, first and foremost, the ones that would interest us in the context of organized crime, are the ability to go after third parties who are cooperating with these organizations. So as an example, a mine that's paying an extortion fee to a criminal group in an area for protection. Businessmen who are involved in the export and import of precursor chemicals for fentanyl in Mexico. Individuals who are not necessarily part of the organization, but who have transactions with it the FTO would broaden the net of where prosecutors could look and where the forensic intelligence could go. So that would be sort of the upside of using an FTO like this. And first of all, to be very clear, an FTO does not authorize foreign military action. However, the part that concerns us is that politically, we fear this could pave the way for those sorts of operations in a way that would likely be counterproductive to stabilizing, first of all, Mexico, where the groups were designated, as well as the broader region. I think we've learned from many years of operations of trying to break up large drug cartels like this, that it often results in more violence, in splits to the organization, fragmentation, more resilient networks that are harder to dissect. So I think we're very concerned about the potential political implications of an FTO on these organizations. Now, the Gulf Clan in particular in Colombia is a very interesting organization because it functions in many ways like a multinational company. The Gulf Clan today has a presence in roughly a third of Colombia, where they are the dominant actor exporting cocaine, also trafficking arms, also controlling the Darien Gap through which migrants passed northward. So in some ways, the FTO would give us tools to, for example, look at the third parties that they are transacting with. We know that there's deep cooperation between certain parts of the regional business community in these areas and the organization. However, again, I think that regardless of what we call it, this is a threat that needs to be treated in a holistic manner. Organized crime is not a target that you can hit with a hammer. Organized crime is a target that you need to work at through investigations, networks, putting together puzzles of who's working with who. And I think the FTO is not necessarily the most useful tool in that regard.
My further understanding is that, especially with respect to security assistance and humanitarian assistance, there are limitations on what governments can do in terms of that kind of assistance as well when there's the known presence of a foreign terrorist organization in that area. Is that correct?
That's absolutely true. And that's actually a very important point to note. For example, the foreign terrorist designation of the former FARC, who have now laid down arms, remained in place for 5 years after that demobilization and really limited the role that the US government could play in terms of influencing the rollout of certain parts of the peace agreement because US officials could not interact with demobilized ex-combatants. So, for example, USAID could not be involved in reincorporation efforts. They could not be involved directly with ex-combatants. They could not sit at the political table to talk with former FARC to help deal with frustrations in the rollout of the process. So if we're thinking about a sort of long-term presence for the US as a partner in the region, in some ways it's a very counterproductive tool in the sense that it's always easier to put a designation on than it is to take it off. And we've seen that and how long it can take to remove the designations. Having said that, Colombia is a place that's very used to operating with groups designated. The ELN is designated. Dissidents of the former FARC are designated. They have been for many years. And so I think for the Colombian government, such a policy would not necessarily affect their own ability, for example, to negotiate peace with any of these organizations.
I want to ask you a question about Ecuador. In particular, President Noboa has recently stated that Ecuador would be open to partnering with foreign armed forces to respond to the security crisis. You mentioned before the history of the U.S.-Ecuador security relationship, and in particular, how we have lost space in that relationship. I think you were making reference to the base at Manta, which was then removed under the Correa government. Notably, Noboa has said that that could be back on the table. These are the types of things that we're talking about here. So in your opinion, how likely are we to see a stronger U.S.-Ecuador security partnership under the Trump administration?
It's a good question, and I think it would be a very positive development. To put the picture in context, Ecuador has long been a transit site for drugs, but since 2020 particularly, the levels of drugs leaving Ecuador have grown exponentially, as have the number of armed and criminal groups, as well as the influence of international traffickers. So today, the two largest national traffickers in Ecuador partner directly with Mexican cartels to traffic cocaine, particularly to Europe. And a significant portion of the cocaine that's going into Europe can be traced in some way to being routed through Ecuador. So when this started happening, I think a few years ago, frankly, it caught everyone by surprise. It caught the Ecuadorians by surprise. It certainly caught the Europeans by surprise. And I think it caught the United States by surprise. And over the last year and a half, particularly as Ecuador has sought greater cooperation with the United States, I think that this has been the opportunity to seize. Europeans are seizing it. They are moving in a big way. And that's very important, I think, to improving the capabilities that the Ecuadorians have to understand what's happening, to go after it, to have the intelligence and capabilities to target this very alarming threat. And I hope that the United States sees that opportunity. Because again, if that opportunity is missed, it might not return. It could be filled by Europe. It could be filled by other partners. Ecuador already has a very strong commercial relationship with China, and it wouldn't take much for that to become a security relationship as well.
Beth, you've naturally led me to my next question, which is what you've started to answer. Who fills the void? All of these cuts create opportunities for a host of other actors to step in. And while many of them, especially the ones that you mentioned, have benign intentions, others might be a little bit more troubling from a US or hemispheric stability perspective. Many have, of course, worried about and said that the United States walking back some of its foreign aid opens the door to the PRC. In the region, have you seen moves by China seeking to exploit this current opportunity, and in particular in the security space?
Absolutely. I think that this is one of the main impacts that this crisis will have. Regardless of how it's resolved, the United States has planted the question in the minds of politicians across the region, and particularly in the minds of security forces, as to the reliability of the United States as a partner. So immediately when this freeze started happening, we saw conversations starting up in the security forces that I have never heard before in the years that I've worked in Colombia about potentially looking for new sources of support. Colombia has to protect its own interests. If the United States declines to continue providing the support that they have, particularly in air power, for example, there are Chinese companies standing by ready to make those offers. The Chinese have been here very actively trying to make that offer for years. And all of a sudden now what we see is they're starting to get meetings. So this is not an imaginary shift. This is a real shift that I think has been entirely of the United States' making.
I would also note for our listeners that the Chinese ambassador in Bogota has been very, very active on social media. Lately, I'm sure you've seen this as well, Beth, promoting strong ties between China and Colombia. And I think the quote, if I remember it correctly, is, "Never have we had as good a relation as we do now in the past 45 years. So clearly they are trying to take advantage of this opening. I want to ask you one final question, Beth, which is potentially a more benign player in this conversation about the void, and that's the European Union. They're another player which could potentially step in and replace some of this vanishing U.S. assistance. In Colombia, for instance, the EU has long desired a larger role in the peace process. How likely is it that we will see an expanded role for Europe in providing foreign assistance in Latin America?
What I can tell you is that the phones have been ringing off the hook in European embassies since the USAID freeze. And a lot of that is from civil society organizations who had previously had support or received assistance, capacitation, these types of issues from USAID. But another big part of it was frankly from the government. The USAID and US assistance in general has been an enormous support to improving the technocratic capabilities of the government here, whether that's on gender equality or ethnic issues or land titling. US support has really helped improve the way that governance happens when it comes to issues of peace and stability, as well as the humanitarian response. The reality is that Europe cannot fill this gap. If you put together all of the aid funding from all European countries and the EU, it's not even half of the whole that the US funding would leave. With other realities in the world, the situation in Ukraine, with the ongoing crisis in Gaza, humanitarian issues, Congo, the list is very long. And unfortunately, I think in Colombia, Europeans are largely maxed out. They're very active in involvement in the peace agreement, but their financial power simply can't match the hole that was just created by the US assistance freeze.
Beth, as my exit question, I want to ask you if there's anything that we did not cover, something else that you would like to highlight or add in this conversation?
I think one of the points that I think is really important to understand is that the US aid freeze and the US security assistance freeze is in many ways very counterproductive to the same interests that the US administration has articulated. So obviously we've discussed this in the security context, but I'll give you another, which is in terms of migration. Some of the programs that were initially frozen and now figure among the definitive cuts of USAID supported Venezuelan migrants to integrate here in Colombia so they wouldn't seek refuge in the United States. These were programs that helped stabilize the integration of refugees in the region to reduce the long-term push factors of migration. Colombia is host to more than 3 million Venezuelan refugees, the largest number of any country and a very high percentage relative to its population. And USAID had been fundamental to helping the Colombian government integrate those people so that they felt they have an economic future here. Another example, again, peace accord implementation. The 2016 peace accord was very unique in the sense that it addressed a lot of the root causes that continue to create a recycling of conflict here in Colombia. Inequality between urban and rural areas, access to land, and all of those issues were at the heart of what U.S. foreign assistance was doing here. If we leave those areas behind, the medium and long-term result will be the same instability that produces and recycles organized crime and the very issues that the U.S. administration says that it's trying to tackle.
Elizabeth Dickinson, Senior Analyst for the Andes at Crisis Group. Thanks so much for joining us on 35 West. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks again for the invitation.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.